The winter wind swept through the streets, carrying bits of newspaper and empty cups along the sidewalk. People hurried past, heads down against the cold, focused on getting somewhere warm. Among them walked a man whose weathered face told stories of hardship. His name was Robert, though most people in town simply knew him as the homeless guy who wandered their streets. Robert's clothes were worn thin, layers piled upon layers in a failing attempt to keep warm. His beard had grown wild over months without proper care, and his eyes, once bright with hope, now carried a distant look. He clutched a small paper bag containing everything he owned in this world, a change of socks, an old photo of happier times, and exactly $2.17 in loose change. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted from a small cafe on the corner. Pete's Place, the sign read in faded letters. Robert paused outside, watching through the window as people sat in comfort, laughing over steaming mugs. His stomach growled painfully. It had been 2 days since his last proper meal. Making a decision, Robert pushed open the door. The bell jingled cheerfully, announcing his arrival. The warm air inside felt like an embrace after the bitter cold, but the welcoming atmosphere quickly changed. Conversations quieted. A few customers glanced up, then quickly looked away. The barista behind the counter stiffened slightly. Robert approached slowly, counting his coins in his palm. "Cup of coffee, please," he said softly. "Just black." The barista, a young woman with kind eyes despite her obvious discomfort, nodded. "That'll be $2.50, she said. Robert's face fell as he stared at his $2.17. He hadn't realized prices had gone up again. "I'm sorry," he began, preparing to leave as he had so many times before. At a small table near the window sat a man in his 30s, dressed in a simple work uniform. He had been watching the interaction unfold. He wasn't wealthy by any means, just a factory worker who stopped for coffee each morning before his shift. His name was David. "I've got it," David called out, standing up and approaching the counter. He placed a $5 bill down. "And a muffin too, whatever kind he wants." Robert turned, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "You don't have to." "I know," David said with a simple shrug. "I want to." The barista's tension eased as she prepared the order. Robert chose a blueberry muffin, and with trembling hands, accepted both items. He thanked David repeatedly, his voice thick with emotion. "Join me?" David asked, gesturing to his table. The cafe had gone quiet again, but for a different reason now. People watched curiously as the homeless man sat down with the factory worker. Robert sipped his coffee slowly, savoring its warmth. The muffin he broke into small pieces, eating each one deliberately. David didn't press him to talk, simply continued drinking his own coffee. "Been on the streets long?" David finally asked. Robert nodded. 3 years now," he said. "Lost my job at the factory when they downsized. Then my apartment. Then everything else." He didn't mention that the factory had been the same one where David now worked. He'd recognized the uniform immediately. "I know how fast it can all slip away," David said. "I was almost there myself a few years back." As they talked, something remarkable happened. The initial discomfort in the cafe dissolved. Other customers stopped staring and returned to their conversations. The barista brought over fresh coffee refills, "on the house," she said with a smile. What David couldn't know, was that Robert had been contemplating giving up that very morning. The endless cycle of street corners and rejection had worn him down to nothing. He'd been walking without direction, without hope, when the scent of coffee had caught his attention. "I worked construction for 30 years, Robert shared after a while. "Good with my hands. Can fix just about anything. Just haven't found anyone willing to hire me looking like this." He gestured to his appearance. David nodded thoughtfully. My landlord's looking for a maintenance person for his buildings. Part-time to start. I could put in a word. Robert's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something long forgotten sparking within them. You do that? Got a phone number? David asked. Robert's expression fell. No phone. David checked his watch. I've got 40 minutes before my shift. There's a shelter 3 blocks from here that has a program. They give you a clean set of clothes, a haircut, and a prepaid phone for job hunting. I could walk you over. For a long moment, Robert said nothing. The simple acts of kindness, first coffee, then conversation, and now a genuine chance, were almost too much to process. In a world that had trained him to expect nothing, these gestures felt enormous. Why? Robert finally asked. Why help me when everyone else just walks by? David stirred his coffee thoughtfully. 4 years ago, I was drinking too much, lost my job, and my wife took the kids and left. I was sleeping in my car when a stranger paid for me to stay 2 nights in a motel. Those 2 nights gave me enough rest to think clearly, apply for jobs, and start over. He shrugged. I'm just passing it on. Other cafe patrons had been listening. A woman at the next table slid a business card toward them. I work at the community college, she said. We have a program for adults looking to learn new skills. Another man approached, mentioning his brother owned a barbershop and would provide a free haircut. By the time David and Robert left the cafe 40 minutes later, something had fundamentally changed. Not just for Robert, who walked with a straighter posture and a cautious sense of possibility, but for everyone who had witnessed what had transpired. The homeless man who had entered the cafe that morning wasn't just a nameless figure to avoid on the street anymore. He was Robert, a skilled worker, a human being who had fallen on hard times, and someone worth helping back to his feet. And it had all started with a simple cup of coffee. The shelter was busier than usual that morning. People lined the hallways, some waiting for showers, others for the clothing donations that arrived every Tuesday. Robert hesitated at the entrance, clutching his paper bag tighter. He had avoided shelters for months, too many stories of theft, too many faces lost in despair that mirrored his own. They know me here, David reassured him, nodding to a staff member who waved in recognition. Been volunteering once a month since I got back on my feet. The shelter coordinator, a gray-haired woman with efficient movements, greeted David warmly before turning her attention to Robert. New friend, she asked without judgment in her voice. This is Robert, David explained. He's looking for work. Construction background, good with repairs. The coordinator, her name tag read Mrs. Chen, looked Robert over with practiced eyes. The shower rooms are open now. We've got clean clothes in the back. I'll find something that fits while you clean up. Robert found himself guided through the shelter's routine with gentle efficiency. The hot shower was his first in weeks, and as the water washed away layers of grime, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be clean, to be human again. When he emerged, a set of clean clothes waited, simple jeans and a flannel shirt, worn but dignified. Mrs. Chen herself trimmed his beard and hair, her hands steady and sure. 20 years as a hairdresser before I retired, she explained as she worked. Now I do this 3 days a week. Everyone deserves to look in the mirror and recognize themselves. By the time she finished, Robert barely recognized the face staring back at him from the cloudy mirror. The wild-looking stranger had been replaced by someone familiar, the person he used to be before the streets had claimed him. David, who had been making phone calls, returned with a smile. My landlord can meet you tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Mrs. Chen handed Robert a basic prepaid phone. Program David's number in, and mine too. Shelter rules, you check in every other day for the first month. We're investing in you. David had to leave for his shift, but Robert stayed at the shelter, helping Mrs. Chen sort through donation boxes. As they worked, she asked about his story, listening without interruption as he shared how quickly his life had unraveled after losing his job. "Had my own place for 30 years, Robert said, folding a clean blanket. "Paid taxes, never caused trouble. Then suddenly, I'm invisible. People cross the street when they see me coming. Start treating you like you're not human anymore." Mrs. Chen nodded. The hardest part of homelessness isn't always the lack of shelter. It's the lack of being seen. Later that afternoon, Robert visited the community college with the business card from the woman at the cafe. The advisor explained their program for adults seeking to update their skills: computer basics, modern construction techniques, certification courses. When Robert admitted he had no address or way to pay, the advisor didn't dismiss him. "We have scholarships specifically for people in transition," she explained. "And the shelter address works for registration. You wouldn't be our first student who started from there." Walking back to the shelter as evening approached, Robert felt a strange lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The practical matters remained daunting. He still had nowhere permanent to sleep, no income, no guarantees. But for the first time in 3 years, he had something that the streets had stolen from him: possibility. At the shelter dinner that night, he sat with others whose stories echoed his own. A former nurse who'd lost everything to medical bills after her husband's illness. A young man barely 20 who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. An elderly veteran whose pension wasn't enough for rent in a city where prices kept climbing. "Heard Mrs. Chen gave you the phone," the veteran said. "That means she sees something in you. She doesn't waste resources." "Got a job interview tomorrow," Robert replied, still hardly believing it himself. "First one's the hardest," the nurse said. "After that, it gets easier to believe you belong in those rooms again." That night, on a shelter cot that felt like luxury after park benches and doorways, Robert lay awake. The day's events replayed in his mind: the cafe, David's simple act, the cascade of kindness that followed. He wondered what would have happened if he'd walked past the cafe instead of going in, if David had ignored him like countless others had before. Morning came early at the shelter. Robert was up before sunrise, carefully putting on his clean clothes, rehearsing what he would say to the landlord. Mrs. Chen found him standing nervously by the door an hour before he needed to leave. "Sit," she instructed, pouring him coffee from the shelter's industrial-sized pot. "Eat something." Nerves on an empty stomach never helped anyone. The landlord's office was a small room above a hardware store, cluttered with papers and maintenance requests. The man himself, a stocky fellow with rolled-up sleeves and ink-stained hands, barely looked up when Robert entered. "So you're David's guy," he said, shuffling through a stack of forms. "He says you know your way around repairs." "Yes, sir," Robert replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. 30 years in construction. Electrical, plumbing, carpentry, I can handle most things." The landlord finally looked up, assessing Robert with sharp eyes. "Got 6 buildings in this neighborhood. Always something breaking. Current maintenance man's retiring next month, but I need help now. It's part-time to start, room in one of the buildings instead of pay for the first 3 months. After that, we'll see." Robert blinked, processing the words. "A room? Nothing fancy. Studio apartment in the basement of the Pine Street building. Needs work itself, which would be your first project. Previous tenant left it a mess." For a moment, Robert couldn't speak. The offer wasn't just work, it was a home. A door he could close, a space that would be his. "When can I start?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The landlord handed him a key. "Today. David vouched for you, and I trust his judgment." He paused, then added gruffly, "Everyone hits rough patches. What matters is what you do when someone offers a hand up." The key felt impossibly heavy in Robert's palm, a small piece of metal that represented everything he'd lost and might now begin to reclaim. The basement apartment on Pine Street was exactly as the landlord had described it, a mess. Water stains marked the ceiling in one corner, the sink leaked, and years of neglect had left the walls dingy and peeling. But as Robert stood in the doorway, surveying what would become his first home in 3 years, he felt nothing but gratitude. "It's not much to look at now," the landlord said, flipping on the single overhead light. "Previous tenant wasn't what you'd call house-proud. Left in the middle of the night 6 months ago, owing 3 months' rent." Robert walked the perimeter slowly, his experienced eyes noting every flaw, every needed repair. The cold concrete floor, the bathroom with its rusted fixtures, the small kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, it was more than he'd dared hope for just 24 hours earlier. "I can fix it all," he said confidently. "Give me 2 weeks and some supplies." The landlord handed him a credit slip for the hardware store downstairs. "Start with the essentials: plumbing, electricity. Cosmetics can wait. There's a maintenance closet in each building with basic tools. My cell number's on the paper if you need anything urgent." He paused at the door. "First tenant complaint lands on my desk, we'll have problems. Otherwise, I don't micromanage." Alone in his new space, Robert sat on the bare mattress the landlord had left and let reality sink in. Yesterday he'd been contemplating the end of his journey, today he had keys in his pocket and a purpose for tomorrow. The weight of it, both the responsibility and the opportunity, settled on his shoulders. His phone rang, the prepaid one from Mrs. Chen. It was David. "How'd it go?" David asked without preamble. "I got it," Robert replied, still disbelieving. "Started today. Got a place to stay as part of the deal." David's approval came warm through the phone. "That's great news. Listen, I'm on break, but wanted to check in. Some of us from the cafe are getting together this weekend, nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation. You should join us." The invitation caught Robert off guard. His social circle had dwindled to nothing during his years on the street, interactions limited to brief exchanges at soup kitchens or nods to fellow homeless people. The idea of casual socializing seemed alien now, almost frightening. "I'll think about it," he managed. After the call ended, Robert began taking inventory of what needed to be done. The water damage would require checking the pipes above, the electrical outlets needed testing, the windows wanted weather stripping. Work had always been his refuge, the one area of life where he knew his worth. He spent that first day cleaning, scrubbing floors, walls, every surface until his hands were raw. By evening, the apartment smelled of bleach instead of mildew. It wasn't beautiful, but it was cleaner than any place he'd slept in years. That night, lying on the thin mattress, Robert found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. The silence of having walls around him felt strange after so long under open skies. The very privacy he'd craved now felt unsettling. Twice he startled awake, disoriented, reaching for his paper bag of possessions before remembering where he was. The next morning, he went early to the hardware store. The owner, a woman with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude, helped him select what he needed within the budget the landlord had provided. "You the new maintenance guy at Tom's Buildings?" she asked as she rang up his purchases. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded approvingly. About time he found someone. Those places need a person who knows what they're doing. She paused, then added, "I'm Lisa. Been running this store 30 years. You need advice on any repairs, you ask." Word traveled quickly in the neighborhood. By mid-afternoon, as Robert was fixing a leaking pipe in one of the other buildings, tenants began approaching him with small requests, a stuck window here, a wobbly banister there. Each interaction was brief, professional, but underneath ran a current of something Robert had forgotten existed: community. On his third day, while replacing a broken ceiling light in the third-floor hallway, Robert encountered a young mother struggling up the stairs with groceries and a fussing toddler. Without thinking, he set down his tools and offered to help carry her bags. "You're the new maintenance man," she said, shifting her child to her other hip. "I'm in 3B. Been telling Tom for weeks about the leak under my sink." "I can look at it now if you'd like," Robert offered. Inside her apartment, Robert worked quickly to fix the leaking pipe while the young mother, her name was Priya, made tea. Her toddler watched him work with solemn curiosity. "You're the first maintenance person who's actually fixed anything in months," Priya said, setting a mug of tea near him. "The last guy just put buckets under the leaks." As they chatted, Robert learned she was a nursing student, taking classes at night while working part-time during the day. Her parents watched her son when they could, but often she brought him to class, sitting in the back row so she wouldn't disrupt others. "It's hard," she admitted, "but we're making it work." Her determination reminded Robert of his own daughter, now grown and living across the country. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, his shame over his circumstances had kept him from reaching out even when he'd had the chance. Back in his basement apartment that evening, Robert found himself thinking about connections, those broken and those newly forming. He thought of David's invitation to meet with others from the cafe, of Mrs. Chen's steady presence at the shelter, of Lisa at the hardware store and Priya in 3B. Small threads beginning to weave something that resembled a social fabric. The weekend arrived, and with it, the choice whether to accept David's invitation. Robert had spent days immersed in work, finding satisfaction in fixing broken things, in making spaces more livable for others. But the prospect of sitting in a cafe, not as the homeless man being pitied, but as just another person, filled him with equal parts longing and dread. When Saturday morning came, Robert showered in his now functional bathroom, dressed in his clean clothes, and made a decision. With steps that grew more certain with each block, he walked to Pete's place, the cafe where everything had changed days earlier. David was already there, sitting at the same table by the window. With him sat the woman from the community college and 2 others Robert didn't recognize. They were laughing about something when he entered, the bell jingling above the door just as it had before. This time, though, no conversations halted. No one stared or looked away. The barista, the same young woman from before, smiled in recognition. "Coffee?" she asked. "It's on the house today." Robert nodded, finding his voice. "Yes, please. Black." As he approached the table, David stood to greet him, extending a hand not out of pity but respect. And in that moment, Robert understood that what had begun as one customer's simple gesture had become something far more powerful. It had become his return to the world of the scene. The cafe gathering was nothing like Robert had feared. No one asked intrusive questions about his time on the streets or made him feel like a charity case. Instead, conversation flowed naturally around neighborhood happenings, funny stories from work, and plans for an upcoming community garden project. Beside David sat his wife, Nita, a kindergarten teacher with a warm smile and practical perspective. "The school where I teach is looking for a part-time custodian," she mentioned casually. "The hours would complement your work with Tom's buildings, if you're interested in something more." The community college advisor, whose name was Beth, had brought information about evening classes. "The basic construction certification takes 16 weeks, she explained, spreading brochures on the table. "With your experience, you could test out of some modules. The industry's changed, everything's computerized now, but the fundamentals are the same." As Robert sipped his coffee, he felt the strange sensation of being treated as someone with a future. These weren't people discussing a homeless man's problems, they were colleagues and neighbors talking about next steps. "I'm thinking about the community garden," the barista, her name was Jenny, said as she joined them during her break. "My apartment building's on your landlord's property. That vacant lot behind it would be perfect. I could build some raised beds," Robert offered. "Make them wheelchair accessible too." Had a buddy in construction who specialized in accessible designs. For 2 hours, they sat together, coffee cups refilled multiple times. When they finally parted ways, Robert had a job application for the school position, registration forms for night classes, and a list of materials needed for the garden project. Back in his apartment, Robert pinned these papers to the wall, tangible proof of forward momentum. 1 month ago, he'd been hunting for safe places to sleep. Now he was making plans that stretched weeks and months ahead. The basement space was improving daily. He'd repaired the plumbing, fixed the electrical issues, and patched the water damage in the ceiling. The landlord, impressed with his efficiency, had authorized additional supplies for cosmetic improvements. "You're making that place worth actual rent," Tom remarked during a check-in. "Keep going like this, and I might have to start paying you a real salary sooner than we agreed." The rhythm of regular work anchored Robert's days. He woke early, addressed urgent repair requests first, then worked on his own apartment or assisted other tenants. People began to greet him by name in the hallways. Some invited him in for coffee or left him thank-you notes. After years of being avoided, being welcomed felt almost overwhelming. One evening, as Robert was walking back from the hardware store, he spotted a familiar figure huddled in the doorway of an abandoned building, a homeless man he recognized from his time on the streets. "Joe?" he called tentatively. The man looked up, his gaze guarded until recognition dawned. "Bobby? Man, I didn't recognize you. Cleaned up. Heard rumors you'd gotten off the street." Robert approached slowly, remembering how he'd shared food with Joe during several hard winter nights. "You doing okay? Getting to the shelter?" Joe shrugged. "They're always full lately. Been trying for 3 days." A month earlier, Robert would have simply nodded in sympathy and moved on, another street person with nothing to offer. Now, he hesitated, then said, "I've got a couch. It's not much, but it's warm. You can shower too." That night, Joe slept on Robert's second-hand couch, clean for the first time in weeks. As Robert lay in his own bed, listening to his friend's steady breathing, something shifted in his understanding of his journey. The circle had already begun to close, he was now extending to others what had been extended to him. In the morning, Robert called Mrs. Chen. "Got a friend who needs help," he explained. "Like I did." "Bring him in," she said without hesitation. 9 o'clock. "I'll make space." After dropping Joe at the shelter, Robert headed to Tom's office with a proposal he'd been working on for days. "I want to talk about the basement apartments in your other buildings," he began. "The ones you said were too much trouble to rent out." Tom looked up from his paperwork, eyebrows raised. "What about them? I think we could renovate them as transitional housing. Partner with the shelter. People get a stable address while they find work, learn skills. I could train them to help with maintenance." Tom leaned back in his chair, contemplating. "You're talking about a lot of work. A lot of risk." "I'd oversee everything," Robert pressed. "Screen candidates through Mrs. Chen. Start small, 1 unit, see how it goes." "And what's in it for me?" Tom asked, though his tone lacked real skepticism. "Tax write-offs. Reliable maintenance help. Buildings that increase in value instead of deteriorate. And you'd be doing something good." Tom studied him for a long moment. "You've changed since you walked in here a few weeks ago." "I had help," Robert said simply. "Now I want to pass it on." After a lengthy discussion of practicalities, Tom agreed to a pilot program. 1 basement unit would be renovated as transitional housing, with Robert supervising both the renovation and the eventual resident. That evening, Robert called David to share the news. Tom approved the housing project, he said, barely containing his excitement. "And I connected with an old street friend today, got him to the shelter." "That's great," David said. "You're making waves already." "Hey, Nita and I were wondering if you'd join us for dinner Sunday? Nothing fancy, just at our place." The invitation to a family dinner, such a normal thing, struck Robert deeply. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Later that week, Robert began night classes at the community college. Sitting in a classroom after decades away from formal education felt strange, but Beth had placed him in a program for returning adult students. Many of his classmates were also rebuilding their lives, after military service, incarceration, addiction, or personal setbacks. "Today we're covering building codes and how they've evolved over the past decade," the instructor announced. "For those of you with industry experience, this might seem basic, but I promise these regulations have changed significantly." As Robert took notes, he felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. The knowledge he was gaining would serve not just his own future, but potentially help others transitioning from homelessness. Every repair skill, every building code, every certification could become part of something larger than himself. Walking home after class, Robert passed the cafe where everything had started. It was closed for the night, chairs upturned on tables, but he paused to look through the window. The simple act of one person acknowledging his humanity had triggered a cascade of changes that continued to unfold in ways he couldn't have imagined. He thought about how close he'd come to giving up that cold morning, how easily his story might have ended differently. He thought about Joe, now following a similar path of possibility. He thought about the basement apartments that might become stepping stones for others. In the darkened window, Robert caught his reflection, no longer the homeless man with the distant look, but someone with clear eyes and purpose. Someone who belonged in this community. Someone who could help build bridges for others still trapped where he had been. Sunday dinner at David and Nita's modest home felt like stepping into a world Robert had once known but had forgotten existed. Their apartment was small but welcoming, filled with mismatched furniture that told stories of yard sales and hand-me-downs. Photos lined the walls, family gatherings, vacation snapshots, their wedding day. Nita greeted him with an easy warmth that immediately put him at ease. "David's been talking about you non-stop," she said, taking the potted plant he'd brought as a gift. "I was beginning to think he'd invented you." Their two children, a boy of about 10 and a girl who looked around 8, watched him curiously from the hallway until Nita called them over for introductions. "This is Sam, and this is Leela," she said. "Kids, this is Mr. Robert, the one who's helping build the community garden." "Dad says you know how to fix anything," Sam declared, sizing him up. Robert smiled. "Almost anything. Still working on time machines and broken hearts." The ice broken, dinner unfolded with easy conversation. David and Nita had created a home where laughter flowed naturally, where small mishaps, like Sam spilling his water, were met with good humor rather than tension. As they ate, Robert thought of his own family, the one he'd lost touch with years ago. His daughter would be 32 now, perhaps with children of her own. He hadn't allowed himself to think of her much during his darkest days. The pain of that separation had been too great to bear alongside everything else. "You got quiet," David noted, passing him a second helping of Nita's curry. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking," Robert replied. "Been a long time since I sat at a family table." After dinner, while the children cleared dishes, Nita brought out a photo album. "David mentioned you used to work construction. Thought you might be interested in this. It's the community center renovation project I volunteered with last year." The photos showed a dilapidated building transformed into a bright, welcoming space. Robert recognized the techniques used, the careful restoration of original elements alongside modern updates. "They're looking for experienced people for the next phase," Nita said casually. "East Side Community Center. The project coordinator's a friend." By the time Robert left that evening, he had another contact name, another possibility added to the growing web of connections that was becoming his safety net. Walking home through streets that no longer seemed hostile, Robert made a decision. Tomorrow, he would try to find his daughter. The search began at the public library the next afternoon. The librarian helped him navigate social media sites, showing patience as he slowly typed his daughter's name into search bars. An hour of searching yielded nothing conclusive: too many women with the same name, too many dead ends. "Have you tried people finder websites?" the librarian suggested. "Some are free, though they don't always have current information." Robert shook his head, overwhelmed by how complicated it had become to find someone in an age of supposed connectivity. "I could help you draft a letter," the librarian offered. "If you know her last known address or her mother's name, the post office might forward it." The mention of his ex-wife's name triggered a memory. "Her mother's sister, my daughter's aunt, she owned a bakery in Westville. Never moved. My daughter might have stayed in touch with her." The librarian smiled. "That's a solid lead. Let's see what we can find." By closing time, they had located the bakery, still in business after all these years. Robert left with the phone number written carefully on a slip of paper, his heart pounding with equal parts hope and fear. He didn't make the call that night, or the next. The paper burned in his pocket as he went about his work, meeting with Tom about the transitional housing project, checking in with Joe at the shelter, attending his evening classes. "You seem distracted," Beth commented after class, as they walked toward the bus stop. "Coursework too challenging?" "No, it's not that." Robert hesitated, then showed her the paper. "Found a way to maybe contact my daughter. Haven't spoken to her in 5 years." Beth's expression softened. "That's a big step. What if she doesn't want to hear from me? What if she's ashamed of what happened to me? What if she's been looking for you too?" Beth countered gently. "What if she needs to know you're okay?" That night, Robert sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his prepaid phone. Outside, rain tapped against his small window, a soothing rhythm that somehow gave him courage. He dialed the number. After 3 rings, a woman's voice answered. "Sweetie's Bakery, we're closing in 15 minutes. Robert cleared his throat. "I'm looking for information about Catherine Moore. She would be your niece. I'm her father." The silence that followed seemed endless. Then, "Robert? Is that really you?" The woman, Linda, his former sister-in-law, had never given up hope of reconnecting the fractured family. She told him his daughter had searched for him when he first disappeared, checking shelters and hospitals. "She has a family now," Linda said. 2 little ones. Lives about an hour from here. She'd want to know you're okay, Robert. She'd want to hear from you." Robert's hand trembled as he wrote down his daughter's number. "Does she know what happened to me? She knows you lost your job, your home. That you were on the streets for a while. She doesn't know where you've been these past few years. None of us did." After the call ended, Robert sat motionless, the weight of possibility pressing on his chest. His daughter had looked for him. Had worried about him. Hadn't simply erased him from her life as he'd feared. The next morning, Robert called David before his shift. "I need advice," he said, then explained about finding his daughter. "Call her," David said without hesitation. "Whatever happens, you'll have tried. That matters." Robert canceled his afternoon repair appointments, telling Tom he needed personal time. Then he sat in his apartment, now painted a warm beige with curtains on the windows and a small bookshelf holding construction manuals and a few novels loaned by Nita. His hand shook as he dialed his daughter's number. 1 ring. 2. 3. "Hello?" A woman's voice, adult, confident, yet with echoes of the teenage daughter he remembered. "Catherine?" he managed. It's your dad." The silence lasted so long he thought she might have hung up. Then he heard a soft intake of breath. "Dad? Is it really you? Where are you? Are you okay?" The concern in her voice, the immediate care rather than anger or resentment, broke something open inside him. As he began to tell her about the cafe, about David's simple gesture, about everything that had followed, Robert felt the final pieces of his old self returning, not unchanged, but perhaps stronger for having been broken and mended. "I'd like to see you," Catherine said when he finished his abbreviated story. "Meet my family. If you're ready." "I'd like that," Robert replied, his voice steady despite the tears tracking down his face. "I'd like that very much." Meeting Catherine was scheduled for the following Sunday, a lunch at a restaurant halfway between their homes. As the day approached, Robert found himself oscillating between excitement and terror. He'd shared the news with his growing circle of friends, each offering support in their own way. Mrs. Chen helped him select a new shirt from the shelter's donations, something nice, but not trying too hard, she advised. David and Nita offered their car so he wouldn't have to take 3 buses to reach the restaurant. Tom adjusted his repair schedule to give him the entire day off. "You've earned it," Tom said gruffly. "Been working non-stop since you started." The night before the meeting, Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror, rehearsing what he might say. How could he explain the last 5 years? The slow descent that began with job loss and ended with him sleeping under bridges? The shame that had kept him from reaching out even when he could have used the shelter's phone? More importantly, how could he explain the miraculous turn his life had taken because one person had seen him as human in a cafe? When Sunday arrived, Robert was up before dawn, too nervous to sleep. He showered, trimmed his beard carefully, and put on his new shirt with jeans that Beth had helped him select. At his small table, he wrote in the journal Mrs. Chen had given him weeks earlier, recording his thoughts for a time when today's emotions might be less overwhelming. David arrived at 10 to drive him to the restaurant. "Nervous?" he asked as they headed out of the city. "Terrified," Robert admitted. "What if she's disappointed? What if her kids are scared of me?" "Just be yourself," David advised. "The man I've gotten to know these past months, that's who she needs to see." The restaurant was a family-friendly place with large windows overlooking a small lake. Robert arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a table where he could watch the parking lot. He ordered coffee, but couldn't drink it, his stomach too tight with anticipation. At precisely noon, a blue sedan pulled into the lot. A woman emerged from the driver's side, tall, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She helped 2 small children out of the back seat, then stood for a moment, looking toward the restaurant entrance. Even from a distance, Robert recognized his daughter's profile, so like her mother's. When they entered, Robert stood, his legs unsteady. Catherine paused in the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes found him. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other across the restaurant. Then she walked toward him, the children following closely. "Dad," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Catherine," he replied, uncertain whether to offer a handshake or attempt a hug. She made the decision for him, stepping forward to embrace him tightly. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "After 2 years of searching, I thought we'd never know what happened to you." The children, a boy about 5 and a girl who couldn't be more than 3, watched this exchange with solemn curiosity. Catherine stepped back, wiping her eyes, and turned to them. "This is your grandpa," she said. "Remember I told you about him? He builds things and fixes broken houses." "Like Bob the Builder?" the boy asked, his head tilted in assessment. Robert laughed, tension breaking. "A little like that, yes. Not as famous, though." They settled at the table, the initial awkwardness giving way to cautious conversation. Catherine told him about her husband, an electrician currently away on a job in another state. She showed pictures on her phone, their modest home, birthday celebrations, ordinary moments of family life. "I tried to find you," she said when the children were occupied with crayons and paper placemats. "Checked shelters, hospitals. Filed missing persons reports. Mom said to give up," that you'd chosen to disappear, but I couldn't believe that. I didn't choose it, not exactly, Robert said carefully. But I did stay away after things got bad. Thought you'd be better off not seeing what had happened to me. Nothing would have made me not want to help you, Catherine said, her voice firm. You were there for every skinned knee, every school play. You taught me to change a tire and balance a checkbook. How could you think I wouldn't want to be there when you needed someone? The naked hurt in her voice pierced Robert deeply. Pride, he admitted. Shame. Fear. All the things that keep us from asking for help when we need it most. As lunch progressed, Robert shared more about his journey, the slow loss of everything, the invisible years, and then the morning in the cafe that had changed everything. 1 cup of coffee, he explained. 1 person who saw me as human. That's all it took to start the change. Catherine listened intently, occasionally wiping away tears. And now you're helping others? Creating transitional housing? Robert nodded. First resident moves in next week. Joe, guy I knew from the streets. He's been working with me, learning the basics. If it goes well, we'll expand to the other buildings. I'm so proud of you, Catherine said, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. What you've been through, what you're doing now, it's incredible. As they were finishing their meal, her son tugged at Robert's sleeve. Mommy says you can fix anything. Can you come see my bike? The chain keeps falling off. The simple request, the normal, everyday sort of thing a grandfather might be asked, filled Robert with a joy he couldn't articulate. I'd like that very much, he said. Maybe next weekend? Catherine smiled. We could come to you, see your place. Meet some of these friends you've told us about. The idea of Catherine seeing his basement apartment might once have filled him with shame. Now, he felt only anticipation. I'd like that. It's not fancy, but it's home. After lunch, in the parking lot, Catherine hugged him again. This isn't goodbye, she said firmly. This is just the beginning. Driving back to the city, Robert was quieter than usual, processing the emotional weight of the day. David respected his silence, only asking, "Good visit?" "Better than I could have imagined," Robert replied. "She wants to bring the kids to see where I live next weekend. Meet everyone." David smiled. The famous grandpa makes his debut. Back at his apartment, Robert sat at his small desk and opened his journal again. He wrote about the lunch, about Catherine's forgiveness, about her children who had accepted him without question. He wrote about the bike chain he would fix next weekend and the dinner he would cook in his tiny kitchen. Then he turned to a fresh page and began making a list: things needed for the transitional housing unit, supplies for the community garden that would break ground next month, ideas for making his apartment more child-friendly for visits. As he wrote, Robert reflected on how profoundly his life had changed in mere months. From contemplating the end of his journey to planning a future that now included family, purpose, and community, all because one person had seen him, truly seen him, in a cafe. 1 year had passed since that cold morning when Robert had pushed open the door to Pete's Place Cafe with $2.17 in his pocket. 1 year since David had paid for his coffee and changed the trajectory of his life. Today, the cafe was filled beyond capacity, folding chairs brought in to accommodate everyone. The usual morning customers mingled with shelter volunteers, building residents, city officials, and Robert's family. Catherine sat near the front, her children beside her, her husband's arm draped casually across her shoulders. Tom had closed the hardware store for the morning so his employees could attend. Mrs. Chen had brought a delegation from the shelter. Beth and several of Robert's classmates from the community college represented the education program that had helped him update his skills. At the center of it all stood Robert, now dressed in a button-down shirt and clean jeans, his beard neatly trimmed, his posture straight with quiet dignity. Beside him, Mayor Wilson held an oversized pair of scissors, ready to cut the ribbon stretched across the cafe entrance. 1 year ago, the mayor began, a series of events started in this very cafe that has transformed not just one life, but our entire community. Today, we celebrate the official launch of the Bridge program, the most innovative transitional housing initiative our city has seen in decades. The crowd applauded as Robert stepped forward. Public speaking had never been his forte, but the journey of the past year had given him confidence he'd never imagined possible. "I was invisible," he began, his voice steady. "That's what happens when you're homeless long enough. People look past you, through you, around you, anything to avoid seeing you. I don't blame them. It's hard to see suffering when you feel powerless to help." He gestured toward David, who stood near the counter where he'd once paid for a stranger's coffee. But sometimes, the smallest gesture can break that cycle. A cup of coffee. A conversation. Simple human acknowledgement. The Bridge program had evolved beyond Robert's initial vision. What had started as a plan to renovate one basement apartment had expanded to include 10 units across Tom's properties, with funding from city grants and private donors. Each unit would house someone transitioning from homelessness, providing not just shelter but job training, connection to services, and most importantly, community. Joe stood proudly as the program's first success story, now employed full-time as Tom's assistant property manager. 3 other formerly homeless individuals had completed the pilot program and moved into permanent housing. 6 more were currently in the program, working and saving for independent futures. "This isn't charity," Robert continued, looking around the room. "It's investment, in people, in potential, in our shared community. Everyone deserves the chance to rebuild, to contribute, to belong." After the speeches and the ceremonial ribbon cutting, people mingled in the cafe, sharing coffee and pastries. Jenny, the barista who had once been uncomfortable serving a homeless man, now managed the cafe's new job training program for Bridge residents. Catherine approached Robert, her children running ahead to claim cookies from a tray. "Dad, that was amazing," she said, hugging him. "Mom's watching online. She couldn't make it, but she's proud too." The mention of his ex-wife, a recent, tentative reconnection, still surprised him. Their phone conversation last month had been awkward but healing, old wounds beginning to mend. "How's the house coming along?" Catherine asked. Robert smiled. The small fixer-upper he'd purchased on the outskirts of town represented yet another milestone, his first owned home since losing everything years ago. With a loan backed by Tom and his steady income from both the maintenance position and his new role as Bridge program coordinator, he'd been able to qualify for a mortgage. "Roof's almost done," he replied. "Your husband's electrical work passed inspection yesterday. And the extra bedroom? For when the kids stay over? Ready and waiting. Bunk beds installed last weekend." David approached, coffee in hand. "Your ears must be burning. Everyone's talking about your speech." "Couldn't have done it without you," Robert said. "Any of it?" David shook his head. "I bought a cup of coffee, Robert. You did all the hard work. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person willing to see another," Robert replied. "The right moment, the right gesture." As the celebration continued, Robert stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The street where he'd once wandered invisible now felt like home. He knew the shopkeepers by name, the bus drivers, the neighborhood children. He belonged here now, woven into the community fabric. A man approached the cafe, his clothes worn, his gait hesitant, someone clearly down on his luck. Robert recognized the look immediately, the careful assessment of whether he would be welcome or rejected. Without hesitation, Robert walked toward him. "Morning," he said warmly. "They're celebrating inside, plenty of food and coffee. Would you like to join us?" The man looked startled, then suspicious. "Don't have money for coffee." Robert smiled. "It's on the house today. "I'm Robert," he said, extending his hand. "Tim," the man replied after a moment, taking Robert's hand cautiously. "Good to meet you, Tim. Come on in, get warm. I'd like to tell you about a program we've just launched. Might be something that interests you." As they walked toward the cafe door, Robert caught sight of his reflection in the window, not the homeless man he'd once been, not just the maintenance worker or program coordinator he'd become, but something more complete, a community builder, a bridge between worlds he had inhabited. Inside, the gathering had evolved into an impromptu planning session for the next phase of the Bridge program. Catherine was deep in conversation with Mrs. Chen about family support services. Joe was explaining the maintenance training component to a city council member. David and Nita were helping their children distribute cookies. Tim hesitated at the threshold, that familiar fear of rejection visible in his stance. "It's okay," Robert assured him. "Everyone's welcome here." As they entered, Jenny looked up from behind the counter. "Coffee?" she called. "Two, please," Robert replied. "One for me and one for my friend Tim." He led Tim to a quiet corner table, away from the immediate bustle. "A year ago, I was where you are now," he began, his voice gentle with understanding. "Let me tell you what happened when I walked into this cafe." Around them, the community continued its work, planning, building, connecting. Robert knew that not every story would unfold like his had. The path from homelessness was rarely straightforward, rarely without setbacks. But he also knew the power of that first step, being seen, being welcomed, being valued. As he shared his journey with Tim, Robert watched a small spark of hope ignite in the man's eyes, the same spark that David had ignited in him 1 year ago with a simple cup of coffee and a conversation. One gesture. One moment of human connection. One bridge built between isolation and community. Sometimes, that was all it took to change everything.